It's a pleasure to be here. And as Mats kindly introduced the topic, I would like to talk to you about the case for abundance. High, sustainable, equitable, non-inflationary, stable growth and prosperity for all are possible. But why hasn't that been delivered so far? Let's look at that. Now, since the late 1920s, actually, economists have become increasingly optimistic because there were economists that realized, well, hang on, we can create a lot of prosperity for everyone. It is possible. So this knowledge started to become more widely known. John Maynard Keynes in 1928 gave a lecture, Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, in which he calculated what's going to happen in the coming century. Now we're almost there. It's almost now 100 years later, so we can take stock of his predictions. He looked at productivity in the previous decades and extrapolated, okay, there could be some shocks and events, but if this continues for a century in a certain range, this will generate vast per capita income and prosperity, so much so that people won't have to work anymore. Literally, he spent most of the second half of his lecture and essay on this topic. Well, how are we going to handle this? Because the data is very clear. We don't have to work anymore. Maybe just a few hours per week per person. And he was so convinced of that because the data was very clear that he then spent time thinking about how to stay sane. You know, we should have still some kind of regular lifestyle, and how can we do that? Well, maybe people should voluntarily work for maybe 2 days a week for a few hours, so there is some kind of schedule, that sort of thing. So just to illustrate how convinced he was that his prediction was correct. What's happening 100 years later? Well, we're still working, aren't we? Most of us have to work. And when you look at his calculation, he was actually correct in the productivity growth calculations and income growth calculations. But we still have to work. Why is that? And the answer is the wealth has been generated exactly as he predicted. In fact, it's the upper end of the range that he used in his calculations, which is quite astonishing, really, if you think about it. So it would have been possible by now that none of us has to work. But it's not happening because of the way this prosperity has been distributed. And that's been so extreme that Keynes could not fathom that it would be like this. That a tiny, tiny group of people, of course, they don't have to work, okay? Probably already in the days of Keynes didn't work. But they would continue to reap all those benefits, all this abundance and prosperity, and prevent others from sharing in this. This inequality was so extreme in the distribution of this ongoing growth and prosperity that's where his final conclusion was wrong, and we still have to work. Now, then Second World War hit, and economists, of course, that was a bit of a setback, but in the 50s and 60s, growth was pretty good and optimism returned, and economists started to predict again, we can solve all those problems in the world. And you can ask, the optimism of the 50s and 60s, was that perhaps overdone? With hindsight, many people feel this was overdone. We shouldn't have been so optimistic. Was it reasonable to be so optimistic? Well, I think it was. I agree here with JFK, who said that our problems are man-made, therefore they may be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. So the economists were right when they were optimistic. Still, today the consensus is, no, we can't have so much prosperity. There are limits. Limits to growth, limits to prosperity, limits to abundance. And we hear a lot about those limits, planetary limits. Well, a lot of it is due to the shock that happened in the 70s. And that's one we should think about briefly, because it's very relevant for today. It's the same shock we're experiencing today. So this... The 70s decade set everyone back. And what happened is that we had high inflation and stagnation, stagflation. If you look at the US in 1974, consumer prices jumped by 11%. And then in 1980, 13.5%. These were the peaks in inflation in that decade. Look at some other countries. In some other countries, it was even worse. In Japan, 23% inflation in 1974. In the UK, 24% inflation. Some countries got away a bit better. Sweden, 13.7%. Germany, only 7%. In fact, this range should already tell you, well, hang on, what's really happening here? What is the real cause of this? Of course, you know, the official story is we had an oil shock. And this is an article from just from this year, just from March. It was the oil price shock, which itself was triggered by a war. Remember, that's the official story, a Middle Eastern war, resulting in the OPEC organization cartel to embargo oil exports to the US and Western countries, which happened in October 73. And of course, this is very similar to what's now going on, a war, an oil, gas, fossil fuel supply shock, embargo, sanctions, producing an energy supply shock, driving up energy prices. And in those days, so in September 73, we had $3 per barrel up to $12 per barrel in 74. So quadrupling the price. And that's the shock, we're told. This energy supply shock unleashed rampant inflation and a worldwide recession is what economists have been saying ever since, even just in March this year. But is this really true? That's what we need to examine. The ECP said in their review soon after they were created, this type of oil price shock can never happen again, and now we're really properly prepared. Well, that's already been proven wrong. Perhaps their entire analysis can be proven wrong. So we've been told that these high aspirations for abundance and prosperity for all, they can't happen because of energy supply shocks, resource limits, resource constraints, planetary constraints. But is this really true? And we've got to go back to this 1970s inflation to answer that question. I think we need to understand now how the economy works. And the best way to start on this is to look at banks. Now, if you go out in the streets and you ask anyone, what's the most important thing in the economy? Most people will say things like money, banking, hard work, but they will certainly mention the monetary side. If you ask an economist, they will talk about anything, but not money and not banks. As I'll try to show you today, economics has been one of those research disciplines where a lot of control was implemented very early on. In fact, I think it's been the model for what's been happening in other disciplines, including medicine, medical research much more recently, where you have false theories that are being proclaimed and dissidents are being suppressed and the truth is being suppressed. I think we all know and we all sense banks are somehow important. So let's talk about this. How do banks actually work? Now, you may be surprised to find that for the last century there have been 3 theories of banking. Now, these are three different theories. They're contradictory theories. So the experts hadn't actually agreed on how banks really work. The dominant theory is the financial intermediation theory. That's still proclaimed today. Banks are not so important. They're just financial intermediaries. They gather deposits, do the analysis, then lend out the funds. Just like other non-bank financial players, and also just like financial markets in general. So you don't really have to worry too much about banks. Nothing to see here, walk on. That is the dominant theory. Then slightly older theory, dominant from the 1930s to the 1960s, is the fractional reserve theory, which said each individual bank is just an intermediary, just like that. It's not important. But somehow, this theory still admitted, somehow something is happening in the banking system. And as these banks interact, somehow money is being created. Of course, if you listen to that theory, then you'd realize, okay, there is much more to this. They talk about the money multiplier. Wow, what is that? The money multiplier? That sounds interesting. So I guess when this theory was dominant, they realized, okay, this is still too much information in here. And that's when they introduced the financial intermediation theory. That's now in the textbooks. No more money multiplier, no more money creation in the banking system. But in the fractional reserve theory, each individual bank was only an intermediary. And we have the third theory, which says, no, that's wrong. Each individual bank is not a financial intermediary. Banks don't intermediate. Banks create money. Each individual bank creates money out of nothing, which is perhaps the most radical theory. That one was dominant until the 1920s, 1930s, 100 years ago. Now, which one is correct? I guess the scientific thing is to conduct an empirical test of those three theories. But you'd be amazed to hear that for this whole century, no such test had been conducted. Because the way economics has been operating is to just proclaim something and suppress alternative views without the scientific basis, something very familiar from the last sort of 2 years in the health sciences. Now, these three theories differ in the question of where the money for a new bank loan comes from. So if a bank gives you a loan, a mortgage, the question is, where does that money come from? And that's where these three theories say different things. The financial intermediation theory says it comes from other people's deposits. The fractional reserve theory says it's from excess reserves at the central bank. And the credit creation theory says it comes from nowhere. The banks just invented. Each bank, each local small bank, even Raiffeisen Bank, local community bank, every bank, whether large or small, when they lend, they just invent the money. So this is the textbook story, which is the financial intermediation theory. Banks gather savings, do their job, and then lend out money. And the older story, fractional reserve, the banks put some money with reserves in the central bank. But the third theory had not really been taught for a century, the credit creation theory. And we need to do some empirical tests. Now, economists say banks are deposit-taking institutions that lend money, which seems reasonable. But in social sciences, we have the advantage that the rules, the laws of the social universe are man-made. If you're a physicist, your job is to discover the laws of physics, to discover the laws of nature that have been implemented, and you can't change them. Of course, in social sciences, the big difference is we can change those rules, and the rules are the law. So let's take a legal approach first and check whether it's true that banks at law are deposit-taking institutions that lend money. And what we find is that actually, no, banks don't take deposits and banks don't lend money. And you see that in the law. Because at law, a bank deposit doesn't exist. A bank deposit is simply a loan that you give to the bank. So there is no such thing as a bank deposit at law. Secondly, banks don't lend money. Banks are in the business of purchasing securities, IOUs, debt instruments. Now, when you get a loan from the bank, you say, well, I don't care about those details, give me the money. The bank will purchase your loan agreement, your mortgage agreement. That's an IOU, a debt instrument, a security that you, the borrower, is issuing. And then you say, just give me the money. And the bank, if they're careful, they will say, you'll find it in your account with us. If they say, we'll transfer it to your account, that's incorrect, because no transfer takes place. But you will be credited that money in your account. And where does it come from? From nowhere. It's invented, because deposits are simply the record of the bank's debt to you, because there's no such thing as deposit. It's when you lend money to the bank. And if you borrow money from the bank, then the loan contract also obliges the bank to pay you something, which will be recorded as a deposit that nobody has paid in. It's a fictional deposit that the bank invents and credits you with it. And that is how our money supply is created. So we've had these three theories of banking. And money creation doesn't come in the financial intermediation theory. In the fractional reserve theory, individual banks don't create money, but systemically they do. And in the credit creation theory, each bank creates money, the system creates money. But which one is empirically correct? So I conducted the first empirical test a few years back in the 5,000-year history of banking, and the answer was, well, the financial intermediation theory was rejected. Essentially, I took out a loan from a bank. The bank had to cooperate with me because I had to look inside their system and their operations. What do they do? And I confirmed that, no, the deposits are not touched when the money is paid out to me. The reserves were not touched at all. So where did the money come from that I borrowed? It was just invented out of nothing. There's two papers on this, 2014, 2016. Can banks individually create money out of nothing? If you Google that, you get the paper. It's one of the most downloaded papers in all of Elsevier's scientific publications. So the textbook story is wrong. Banks create money out of nothing. And here's how it works. As I said, the bank will purchase your loan contract, put it on the asset side of the balance sheet. That lengthens the balance sheet of the bank, and then as the bank pays out the money, in inverted commas, it credits the borrower's account with the same amount, which is a bank liability. And the test was about, where does this money come from? It's not transferred from anywhere inside the bank or anywhere outside the bank. It's newly created, and of course it has to match because you've lengthened the balance sheet. And that's how our money supply is created. That's where 97% of our money comes from. The banking system creates it out of nothing. And that's, of course, why banks are important. That's why banks drive the economy, and their decisions reshape the economic landscape. This is called credit creation. So banks create money through the credit creation process. That makes banks very powerful. They make this decision of who gets new purchasing power and for what purpose it's used. Of course, central banks are the powerful institutions that can control the banks and tell them what to do. And very often, they conduct their monetary policy by guiding bank credit, but they usually don't talk about it. They usually don't want people to realize that this is how it works, the fact that banks create money out of nothing, and that monetary policy really only works if it influences bank credit creation. So that's a game changer for all the economic questions. Once you understand this, you realize we don't have to have unemployment. We don't have to have business cycles. We don't have to have recurring banking crises, because these are all accounting problems, accounting fictions that can be very easily solved. They don't have to be real problems if you don't want them to be. And sadly, that's what we find, that often decision makers want them to be problems. We don't have to have underdevelopment. There don't need to be underdeveloped countries. And of course, we don't need to deplete finite resources, but we can actually deploy things so that there is an abundance for everyone. Prosperity for everyone is possible if you deploy bank credit creation correctly. Now that you know this, actually just maybe the technical expression of this. You can put this in some formula. Total money is credit creation in the banking system. You can divide into two streams going into the economy, GDP, national income. Or money creation can also be used for non-GDP transactions, which is asset purchases. When banks lend for the purchase of ownership rights, then money goes into asset markets. And of course, you can imagine when that happens, this is unproductive credit creation. Asset purchases funded by banks, whether it's property, real estate, or financial instruments, or mergers, acquisitions, takeover of other companies, lending to private equity funds, hedge funds, all that's over here. In many countries, that's the dominant form of bank credit, vastly outclassing any other form. And what you then get is asset price inflation. It's like printing a lot of money, pumping it into asset markets. What's going to happen with asset prices? Of course, they're going to go up. It's a Ponzi scheme, a pyramid scheme, a snowball scheme. This will only work while banks continue to create more credit for asset purchases. Once they stop, it's like a game of musical chairs. The music ends. There's not enough chairs for everyone because asset prices don't rise any further. Late-coming investors go bust first. You have non-performing loans. The banks then restrict lending for asset purchases. Asset prices really collapse. Then you have a major banking crisis. This is, of course, unsustainable, unproductive and unsustainable. And because during these asset bubbles, you push up asset prices by several 100%, but from the peak, they only need to drop by 10%, and you've busted the banking system because banks only have 10% or less equity, which is used when you have non-performing loans. And so the banks, therefore, are easily bankrupted and there's easily a banking crisis. But we don't have to have this. It can be easily prevented, or even if you have a banking crisis, you can easily get out of this. The other uses of money, there's one more unsustainable, unproductive form in the real economy, that's consumer loans, as you can imagine, because you create more money, more demand, but there's no more goods and services. Consumer price inflation follows. And then we have the redeeming feature of the banking system. If banks create credit for productive purposes, for productive business investment, for the implementation of new technologies, increasing productivity, you will get growth, you will get prosperity. This also delivers income streams to service and repay the loans, and therefore you don't have systemically the problem of non-performing loans. There's never been a banking crisis due to too much small firm business investment. So, because that's productive business investment that creates jobs and prosperity. And the interesting thing is we can have more growth and higher growth even at full employment, because the only limit to growth actually is human ingenuity, and that is virtually without limit. We have plenty of ideas, new technologies, new inventions. They just need to be funded with credit creation, and you can then implement them and turn them into prosperity, because you get this new value added that's created, and that can be shared. If you have a banking system that is structured so that you can share easily, which is a very decentralized banking system with many small banks, local banks, community banks. But we'll come to that. And so you can test this. This is the quantity theory of disaggregated credit. Credit in the real economy drives GDP. Credit for asset prices, asset purchase drives asset markets. In Japan here, Japanese data, they increased bank credit in the early 70s drastically. In the real estate market, driving up asset prices, real estate prices here, then created a crash. They did this in the UK as well. Mostly central banks operate in a very coordinated fashion. When you increase credit for financial circulation as a share of total credit this dramatically, of course you are creating an asset bubble. That's the creation of the 1980s great Japanese asset bubble, when the little plot of land in central Tokyo around the Imperial Palace was worth as much as the entire state of California, including Los Angeles and San Francisco. These were the data. That was what was created, this massive asset bubble. And here's another way of showing this. Broad credit creation, total credit creation, way in excess of GDP growth. That's this excess money creation for asset purchases, creating an asset bubble. And then a banking crisis the moment you reduce bank credit. So let's now, with this tool and this understanding, we can actually now solve any economic problem. And there's many that traditional theories cannot explain. but since I'm supposed to speak for only 3.5 minutes, I believe, or was that 3.5 per slide? I can't go through all the other puzzles which can be solved with this, but let's just return to the inflation of the 70s. So why do we have this inflation? Remember, they told us it's because of the war and then the OPEC oil embargo and this energy supply shock. But let's look at the data. This is bank credit creation in the US, and we find that it was revved up dramatically by June 71, already growing by 13.5%, which is the highest post-war at that time. And that's 71. Then peak in March 73 at 16.4%. Massive money creation pumped into the economy. What's going to happen with nominal GDP? What's going to happen with inflation? Of course, you are going to create inflation later. The war only happened, and the OPEC oil price shock only happened in autumn 1973. And therefore we know the cause is actually, of course, the credit boom created by the banking system under the auspices of the Federal Reserve. There was a second oil price shock, we're told, in the late 70s. Well, actually, no, that's another credit shock in the late 70s that caused this. And the same is true for other countries. In Germany, bank credit growth expanded by 14%. And that was before the so-called OPEC oil price shock. And that's really why inflation rose. Japan, where we had much higher inflation, well, we had much higher bank credit expansion, 25.5%, December 72. That's before the alleged official cause, the oil price shock. So the 70s inflation was not due to energy prices. And likewise, today's inflation is not due to energy prices or the war. As you know, because of course the war only started in Ukraine, only started the end of February, but the inflation was already very high even before then. So it's quite apparent that the official narrative is wrong. And remember, we looked at this, how the Japanese central bank created a massive asset bubble in 1972. That's never mentioned. Very briefly, let's look at the current situation. A lot of people did not expect the 2020 massive monetary expansion by the Federal Reserve and other central banks to lead to inflation because they compared to 2008. In 2008, it was the other way around. There was a financial crisis. The Federal Reserve massively expanded in quantitative terms, what many people call quantitative easing, and they expected inflation in a weaker dollar. I was one of the few economists who were saying, no, we're not going to get inflation or a weaker dollar because they are not actually creating more money. And that's because the central bank is a small cog in the game of money creation. The banking system is much bigger, and bank credit creation then was shrinking, was negative. That's when the Federal Reserve stepped in and created a lot of dollars, but in absolute terms, total money supply was still shrinking because the banking system was contracting. So of course you couldn't get inflation at that time. But it's been totally different in the 2020 reflation because the Federal Reserve injected money, similarly to 2008, but the banking system has been creating much more money. In fact, it was one of the highest growth rates since the 70s. Then there was a period of contraction, but you notice that the Federal Reserve is not anymore expanding quantitatively this much, but the banking system continues to create credit. So the inflation is going to continue. And of course, inflation is stealth taxation, and it is an unnecessary restriction on the prosperity that we could have. Now, why is this lack of knowledge about inflation and how this really works, and why is there this lack of knowledge about the banking system? Economics was really one of the first scientific disciplines that became systematically controlled, where a false narrative was spread and is being spread at all the leading universities. And it's been the model for other scientific disciplines. And to understand why, you have to understand the politics behind this and the rise of the Washington consensus, because this false economic system that prevents you from seeing the truth is used globally and is used to run the world, essentially. What's the Washington Consensus? Well, the Washington Consensus refers to the Washington institutions created at Bretton Woods in 1944. Initially, the dollar was linked to gold. In August 71, this dollar linked to gold was cancelled, which was a US default on its international obligations. The background here is the Federal Reserve created a lot of dollars, and this was used to purchase European assets. France wasn't part of NATO and therefore could object, and it did object. It sent aircraft carriers to New York, to Manhattan, to pick up the gold reserves. So thanks to France, because the other countries under NATO could not speak up against the Americans, the Americans were held to account, but the response was a default on the obligations to exchange into gold. And since then, the dollar has been floating. And fundamentally, the problem was that Japan and Germany were running huge trade surpluses, and they weren't buying enough things from America. So America had huge trade deficits and current account deficits, and the dollar potentially, after the gold peg was taken off, would fall and fall and fall. So they were thinking fast, how can we stabilize the dollar? And they came up with this idea. What does Japan need? What does Germany need? They need energy. That's where the energy story comes in a different way. And they realized, okay, well, if we tell the energy exporters to only sell their oil against US dollars and nothing else, then Japan needs dollars, Germany needs dollars, Europe will need dollars. This will strengthen the dollar. That, by the way, of course, explains why when last month the Russian President Putin announced that Russian gas exports can only be paid for in ruble, and I was interviewed on that day and said, well, that's a sign to buy the ruble. The ruble's going to go up, and it's been going up and up. It's more than doubled in value. It's now stronger than it was before February 24th. It's the best performing currency in the world. They copied the American trick of linking it to resources. So it's the resource ruble. But there's another story I want to talk about very briefly. When the system was introduced and everything became dollarized and the dollar became the world's currency, this enabled the Washington-based institutions that were created at Bretton Woods, IMF, and the World Bank to exert their control over the majority of countries in the world, which are developing countries, in the following way. It could have been used to help them to develop and gain development and prosperity, but it wasn't used for that. It was used to do the opposite, prevent development, ensure that resources can be extracted from these countries cheaply and their assets can be taken over very easily. So these are the IMF and World Bank policies whereby foreign debt was advised to be given to these countries. They were supposed to borrow from abroad in foreign currency. But developing country currencies tend to weaken over time. But if the debt is in foreign currency, that means their debt in national currency terms is constantly going up and up and up until you need restructuring, debt for equity swap, and their assets will go to the lending countries. And where did the lenders get those dollars from? You know the answer? Where did the US banks get the money from? Nowhere. Exactly. They created it out of nothing. So the whole thing was a trick in the first place. And if we had time, I could show you the mechanism. But when the foreign banks lend to developing country, these dollars or euros, they never arrive because of the rules of the banking system. But they can then result in a domestic credit creation, which the domestic banking system can do without the foreign loan in the first place. So it's a complete trick. But these loans were given only with conditionality, structural adjustment programs, where then the Washington institutions would gain control over the policy decisions of these countries, and inevitably the policies forced on developing countries have been opening up the economies to the rest of the world through trade liberalization, capital account liberalization, and secondly, privatization, deregulation, complete sellout policies to make sure that the Washington institution money and the international banks could take over their resources. So the Washington consensus on development has been the following policies. Free trade will deliver growth and development, prosperity and independence in economic terms. You don't need trade policy. Of course, that was failed because no country has succeeded and developed on this basis. Free market policies are necessary and sufficient to ensure stable, sustainable growth and development, we're told. You don't need development policy. Well, that's failed. Under the IMF and World Bank, these free trade and free market policies were adopted. No country developed on that basis. They stayed mired in underdevelopment and dependency. And then, of course, the justification for this argument is that, well, you need to allow free markets because markets, determine the best outcome. Demand equals supply. We get equilibrium. Markets are always right. That's the story. Now, which developing countries have made it? Which countries have moved decisively from developing country status to developed country status? None. Yes. So, based on these IMF World Bank policies, the answer is none. None have developed on that basis. But there are some countries that have developed, but it's only 5 countries. And they are Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and China. But they did this by adopting policies diametrically opposed to the IMF World Bank policies. They did what was forbidden by the IMF policies and the IMF advice. Japan delivered 2.5 decades of double-digit growth in the 50s to the early 70s. Korea, almost 3 decades of double-digit growth. China, almost 4 decades of double-digit growth. And of course, when you've got double-digit growth for 7 years, you've doubled your national income. So these were enormous boosts to prosperity in these countries. When economists are confronted with this success of these 5 countries, then they will say, oh, that was due to deregulation, liberalization, privatization, IMF policies. And that's absolutely not true. It's quite the opposite. The East Asian high growth model adopted policies contrary to and forbidden by the IMF and the World Bank. Now, how did this happen? Let's look at China, because it's the most recent successful economy and perhaps the one with the most spectacular success. It started when Deng Xiaoping came to power in late 78. And it started with a change in thinking, with a change in methodology. He gave a speech and he said, we need to liberate our thinking from preconceived, unscientific ideas. And he introduced the need to seek truth from facts, as he called it, which is the empirical, the scientific research methodology, as opposed to some made-up ideology like communism. Famously, he said things like, it doesn't matter what the color of the cat is as long as it catches mice. So I don't care about what you call that theory or whatever it is, it must work. Does it work or not? Does it deliver? Whether it's, communist or capitalist or whatever, we need to deliver. And that, of course, was very radical because China dropped evidence-free belief in ideology and false assumptions and axioms, and insisted on a scientific approach to developing the economy. Now, this remains revolutionary in Western economies, because among Western economists, we don't have such an approach. We still stick to ideological adherence to false assumptions and axioms, which I want to show you very briefly, if I may. Now, some of you may not have studied economics. That's fine. We can do it in 2 minutes. Saves you 3 years at university. There's only one graph in economics. That's it. You have prices on one axis and quantities on the other. And we have a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. They use this for everything, whether it's the FX market, the market for BMWs, or the whole macroeconomy, anything. The labor market, then the quantity will be L, and the price will be wage, W. Or the market for money, then this will be M, and the price is interest rates, and so on. And of course, you notice they intersect in one point. That's the point of equilibrium. And the idea is prices move to give us this equilibrium, because if they're too high, prices are too high, so companies will supply more, but demand will be less. You've got excess, you will have excess supply. Companies can't sell their stuff, prices are too high, so then they will reduce prices. And that leads you to equilibrium. If prices are too low, that demand will be stronger, will push up prices until we get to equilibrium. So that's quite sort of convincing. But read the small print. The small print is, this is true, that we get equilibrium, and prices therefore are key, and prices lead us to equilibrium. It's true if and only if at least 8 assumptions hold, and they are perfect information, complete markets, perfect competition, instantaneous price adjustment, 0 transaction costs, no time constraints, profit maximization of rational agents, and also people can't be influenced by others, like Google doesn't exist because advertising doesn't work, things like that. So you see, it's a theoretical dream world, it's a fictional world that may exist on some planet, far removed from planet Earth, but certainly has nothing to do with our planet. And when it comes to the overall economy, this means the key price, because prices are key in this equilibrium framework, the price that moves the economy is the interest rate. Now this is something you will have heard, because essentially all the economic theories agree on one thing: interest rates are key. But these are all the official economic theories. This is the equilibrium economics. And they say that lower rates lead to higher growth, higher rates lead to lower growth. That's essentially the law and the profits in equilibrium economics. And that's true for the last 200 plus years. All the schools of economic thought say this, starting with David Ricardo, neoclassical economics, Keynesian monarchist, new classical, all these different schools of thought in economics. They agree on one thing. They disagree on many other things, okay, but this is what they agree on, that interest rates are key, they drive the economy, and lower rates lead to higher growth, higher rates lead to lower growth. And this is being repeated by central banks for the last 50, 60 years, essentially on a daily basis. You hear this. Now they're talking about, should we have lower rates, negative rates, or should we raise rates because of inflation, and so on. It's still always about moving the interest rate, the price of money, to move the economy. Now, because this is so widely proclaimed for the last 250 years in this alleged social science called economics, you'd assume that there'll be a few empirical studies to demonstrate this link, right? Now, the scientists among you would of course assume that this has been well established, hundreds of studies, thousands of studies. But I have to tell you, the number of studies showing this is exactly 0. There's not a single one. And so I conducted the first study that even actually analyzed this relationship, because that's also very difficult to find. There is none. And our study was very difficult to publish. It took 7 years to get this published, because it was far too sensitive to actually do empirical research on this so well-established question. Here's the study in the journal Ecological Economics, Reconsidering Monetary Policy, also open access, can have a look. I'll just give you the conclusion. We looked at US, Japan, Germany, and the UK, these 4 economies for half a century. And I tell you, the official story, as you know, is an inverse correlation between rates and growth, low rates and high growth, high rates and low growth, inverse correlation, and causation from interest rates to growth. But the empirical reality is the opposite in both dimensions. We have a positive correlation in all countries between interest rates and growth, positive. And timing-wise, it's growth that happens first and interest rates follow. Growth collapsing, then interest rates coming down. It's true also for the US Treasury market, leading US Treasury bond yields, sometimes by up to a year. So this official story, high rates lead to low growth, low rates lead to high growth, is confronted by the empirical reality that high growth leads to high rates, and low growth leads to low rates. That, of course, means you can't use interest rates for monetary policy, which is what they're claiming they're doing. It does raise a number of questions, like what then moves the economy? You know the answer. Bank credit creation. But that's a taboo topic. And you realize this entire interest rate story is a smokescreen for the general public to keep the financial scribblers busy and have something for the financial markets to talk about, a pseudo-rationale. While distracting the attention, the magician getting your attention to this hand, the hat, the rabbit, while the action is taking place somewhere else. And that is, of course, bank credit creation. I found an interesting quote. I was actually attending this seminar, and this former member of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee talked about her time, her years sitting in the Monetary Policy Committee, setting interest rates. I've come to wonder about my time at the Monetary Policy Committee, she said, setting interest rates. It's been a bit of a waste of time, really. Of course. And so this idea that interest rates are key comes from the equilibrium concept, but actually the idea that we have equilibrium is based on these assumptions, and these assumptions are so unrealistic. What is the probability that actually all of these 8 assumptions hold at the same time? Even if you're very generous and let's say, okay, let's assume that each assumption it's more likely to be true than not, more than 50% probability. Well, the probability would be, say, 55% per assumption, but 8 assumptions, that's 0.55 to the power of 8 is less than 1% joint probability of all of them holding at the same time. So these economists that love to give you complex mathematical models haven't done the basic maths, that equilibrium is so unlikely to ever pertain. But then that doesn't bother some people, you know, unlikely things may be quite important in the narrative. Do you recognize this picture? Alice in Wonderland being led by the Queen here. And here's a great quote. Alice laughed. "There's no use trying," she said. "One can't believe impossible things." "I dare say you haven't had much practice," said the Queen. "When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day." That is practice believing impossible things. "Why, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." And now you realize that, of course, Alice in Wonderland couldn't be a good economist. She was far too realistic. But even the Queen in Wonderland, who had most practice in believing impossible things, could not be a good economist. Why? Because it's totally insufficient to only believe 6 impossible things and just before breakfast. If you want to be an economist, you have to believe at least 8 impossible things all the time. So there is no equilibrium, I'm afraid. The joint probability is 0.8% if we assume that each assumption has a probability of 55%, but actually the probability of each assumption is closer to 0. The joint probability is 0 point and then a long string of zeros, which means markets can never be expected to clear. That's a hoax. That's fake economics. There is no equilibrium. But that's, of course, the modern English language economics. The paradigm in economics is based on equilibrium, which doesn't exist. The reason why they're proposing this false narrative is because when you look at the reality, where there's no equilibrium, markets are rationed. Demand is not equal to supply, and that means the short side principle pertains. The short side principle, whichever quantity of demand or supply is smaller, determines the outcome. That's the common denominator for trading. And that gives power to the short side. And that's something you're not supposed to think about. The short side has power to allocate, to pick and choose. And you realize why this fairy tale of equilibrium is so important, because with equilibrium, it's the anonymous markets that are delivering outcome. You're unemployed, well, sorry, you know, this is the markets. Actually, every market is rationed, and the short side has the power of a Soviet apparatchik bureaucrat, if you want, to make an allocation decision which is not made on the basis of the price. Just think of the labor market, where it's pretty obvious. If you've ever been invited to an interview where they ask you, what's the lowest salary that you're willing to work for? Because we're going to select from the 20 applicants the one with the lowest salary. Well, the salary is already fixed. And the allocation decision will be made on other criteria, which may be one of the many ways in which the short side exerts its power and extracts what economists call rent. Non-market benefits. Just think of the Me Too movement and how Hollywood operates. For very attractive jobs, there may be a high price to pay. So the short side principle reveals the reality of resource allocation in our economy. All markets are rationed, And that also means at the same time, if you're thinking of the whole economy and development, well, this Washington paradigm is totally wrong. We don't need these free market policies. In fact, they are the ones that prevent development because they allow the foreign big companies to take over in developing countries. And those countries that made it and had successful development policies and abundance in a short time period for their people, they adopted trade policies, development policies, activist policies that made sure that resources would be allocated in a way that benefits the economy, creates growth and jobs. And of course, at the core of this is the banking system. So if you want high growth, you need bank credit creation for productive purposes. How are you going to get this? How did Japan do it? I examined Bank of Japan and, central bank policy intervention. The standard tools the textbooks write about, interest rates or quantitative operations or reserve requirements, turn out to be irrelevant. There was no story there. But I continued my empirical research and I found out, oh, there's another tool, not much talked about, window guidance, informal, extra-legal central bank guidance of bank credit, also known as directed credit. The central bank sets a quota for the banks, how much credit they're allowed to create. Not just allowed to create, but actually asked to create, because it was a quota they were not allowed to overshoot or undershoot. Here's the window guidance long growth quota. And I press the button, you see the actual bank lending more than 3 months later. And then you know that this is a very powerful control tool, and that's how you run the economy. Most central banks have used this in their history. It's developed in Germany by the Reichsbank 1912. The Fed has used it, the Bank of England has used it, Bank of France has used it. One of the German innovations that were kept since 1941, encadrement de crédit, until the 1980s officially in France even. All the East Asian economies have used it, Thailand, India, and so on. So we can have prosperity, we can have high growth. We just need to make sure that the economic system is run properly. And at the core of this is the monetary system, as you can imagine, the creation and allocation of money. And the best combination of policies is, on the one hand, when you monitor this and make sure bank credit is not used for unproductive purposes, asset purchases that creates asset bubbles and banking crises, or consumption that creates inflation, but is going into the green box of high growth with its business investment for new technologies, implementation of new businesses. SME lending, small firm lending in particular, tends to be very productive. And secondly, if you don't want the guidance, or you can combine it, you can ensure that the banking system is designed so that the banks will always do this automatically. And that's when you have a decentralized banking system consisting of many small banks. The structure of the banking system, if you have many, many small local banks, you will always get more bank credit for productive purposes. And when Deng Xiaoping came to power, he introduced the scientific principle, and he decided to do some scientific research by going around to successful economies. He went to Japan first, and he managed to extract the secret of their high growth system. Window guidance, central bank guidance of bank credit. He introduced it straight away. They used the same expression, window guidance, until today at the People's Bank of China. And secondly, he dropped the Soviet system. The Soviet system was, in the monetary arena, to have essentially one bank, Gosbank, monobanking. That's what central planners love. That's what the globalists love, because it's centralized total control. But it's not very successful in economic terms. If you have a concentrated banking system with a small number of large banks, you only get large lending to large companies, but the small firms don't get money. You need small banks that lend to small firms. And you need a decentralized banking system. So the UK only has 5 big banks. Most of their money most of the bank credit is for property or financial credit. So this is all credit for financial transactions. This is only 14% is for the real economy. Germany has been very successful because, and exports in Germany beating Chinese exports until 2009, when actually, of course, the
population economy is much smaller, but Germany ahead of China, per capita way above China. Why? And a big chunk of German exports are due to small firms, family businesses, small firms owned by families that you don't know the name of. So the name is a bit hidden, but they're global champions in their top 1, 2, 3 market share. They're called hidden champions. If you do international comparison, you'll find that there's more hidden champions in Germany than in any other country in the world. That's a way to have prosperity and abundance, because these are family businesses, local small firms that are enabled to be global market share leaders by what? Number 2 is the US, but there's a huge gap. And the explanation, of course, is the banking system. This is European countries and the number of banks in European countries. Which one sticks out? It's Germany. Why? Because 70% of deposits in Germany are with community banks, small local banks. 80% of all banks are small local community banks. Over 90% of SME lending is from such local banks. And that's what Japan, Korea, and Taiwan have, and that's what China introduced. So Deng Xiaoping started with one monobank and realized quickly, okay, I get it. Scrap that. We're going to have banks. We're going to have a lot of banks. And he created small banks, community banks, savings banks, credit unions, regional banks, provincial banks. Now China has 4,500 banks, just behind the US with 5,300 banks. And so that's the secret to success. So that's what we have to aim for. That's what we should introduce. Then we can have prosperity for the whole world. And of course, developing countries don't need foreign money. They just need community banks and the local banking system supporting firms to have the money to get the latest technology, implement the latest technology, do capital investment. Now, in this context, what are the implications of central bank digital currencies? Well, we've been using digital currencies for ages. Bank digital currencies, BDC, has been around. And CBDC is just a PR way to hide, once again, the true story. So they're simply current accounts offered by the central bank. It would mean that we all would have an account at the central bank. And there's ways of making this attractive to you, but it means that you are cutting out the banking system. And if there's a bit of a shock, where should you put your money? Well, okay, let's shift it to the central bank. This is a way to drastically speed up the centralization of banking systems that's already taking place. Under the ECB, 5,000 banks have disappeared. And it's not the Goldman Sachs banks that have disappeared. It's the small banks, community banks. 5,000 in those 22 years. Central banks are increasing concentration in banking systems. CBDCs will accelerate this dramatically until ultimately there's only one bank left, the central bank, and we have a Soviet monobank system. Because what we see is the central bank, who's the bank regulator, saying, we're going to compete directly against the banks now. That's really what's happening. What about fair competition? Well, if the government does it and the central bank does it, then suddenly all these rules about competition are out of the window. I mean, we know anyway that the anti-monopoly legislation has been very weak in most countries anyway. But this needs to be stopped because we're seeing the attempt to reintroduce the Soviet system. In many ways, of course, the European Union has been modeled on the Soviet Union, with the European Commission being the Politburo, unelected, but the only source of newly proposed laws. And the Soviet Union had a rubber stamp parliament. That's the European Parliament. They do not propose new laws. That comes from the Politburo, the European Commission. But the idea seems to be to also now do that on the economic front. We would therefore have only one bank left, the ECB. And what about economic growth? Well, that's it. No more growth for you guys. Sorry. No more prosperity. Oh, and here's the reason why we should do this. This is how they're trying to sell this to you. Well, we've got limits to growth. Growth is bad. You know, we're being told that, well, we need to degrowth. There should be zero growth. Is this actually true that economic growth is harmful for the environment? No, it's absolutely not true. There is absolutely no contradiction. And it's quite obvious. Think about it. the fundamental reason is that actually there is no growth in terms of physics. What is growth? It doesn't exist. It's an accounting fiction we've created by following certain accounting conventions. Can an accounting fiction hurt the environment? No. What hurts the environment is environmentally harmful things like pollution. And you can have lots of pollution with zero growth, trust me. So growth is not the enemy. Growth is the prosperity that we want to share with everyone. But there seems to be this plan out there to now stop growth by centralizing banking systems, and that's why we have to do the opposite, create small banks, local banks, community banks, so that we will ensure to have that we have growth in our local communities. In fact, the cooperative movement, which has been around for over 200 years, has been very successful and is really the source and basis for the German successful local community banking system. And the cooperative movement has the principle of self-organization, self-determination, self-responsibility, self-accountability, self-action, local self-action. You form groups on the local level and you take action, and of course they introduced laws to make this also legally very easy in Germany, and the legal situation is different in every country, but that was the idea, and it's been very successful. The largest number of banks in Europe are cooperative banks, namely the Raiffeisen Volksbank banks in Germany, and that's a principle we should remember, and we can learn a lot from our ancestors who worked hard to discover this and work out these key principles. Cooperative companies, cooperative entities can be a very resilient way to organize an economy. But in general, beyond the particular corporate structure, is the principle of decentralization and delegating authority and decision-making as much to the lowest level as possible. And that's what we need, the principle of subsidiarity, which is, of course, reflected also in the cooperative movement. I think I've slightly run over. I can just wrap up. Banking systems become too concentrated. Central banks want to concentrate them even further by introducing central bank digital currency. There's a lot of false narratives out there. Most of the things they tell us in economics are wrong. And if you want to find out, okay, so what's the real story here? The simple rule is, it's the opposite of what they tell you. You will almost always be right. And if we had time, and this is not just, a flippant comment, if we had time, I would give you at least 20 instances, very central cases where this can be demonstrated. So this is really a very reliable rule. And I'm very much active trying to set up community banks. If you do that, you get a lot of benefits for the local community and for all the stakeholders involved. And there are material benefits, and it materially changes the situation when you do that. So I set up local first community interest company to establish community banks. We've been doing a lot of work in the UK, where there's several community banks in the process of getting authorized, but also now working in some other countries to establish community banks. If you're interested, get in touch. Some of my books, there's Princes of the End, which has more details, particularly on central bank policy manipulation and how it affects government policies and even geopolitics. Thank you very much. Thanks for your attention.